Commanding in war means signing death sentences. It means looking men in the eyes and knowing you are sending them to die. It means carrying the weight of thousands of lives for the rest of your days. In the Second World War, some commanders found themselves in situations where every order was a death sentence. They had no alternatives, no way out. They could only choose how their men would die. These commanders left testimonies that do not speak of strategy or tactics. They speak of the unbearable weight of command, of the pain of watching men die because of orders you know are useless, of the despair of those who survive while others fall. In this video, we will hear 3 direct testimonies. 3 commanders, 3 different hells, but the same crushing weight of responsibility. To truly understand what it means to command when there is no more hope, their words are enough. First testimony. Karl Strecker, the general trapped in Stalingrad. Karl Strecker was 50 years old when his life turned into a nightmare from which he would never escape. He was a general, commander of the German 11th Army Corps in the 6th Army. January 1943. Stalingrad. The pocket was closing in day after day. There was no food, no supplies, no hope. Hitler ordered them to resist, not to surrender, to fight to the last man. And Strecker had to translate those insane orders into concrete actions. He had to tell starving, frozen men to keep fighting. He had to look at soldiers reduced to skeletons and order them to hold positions that no longer existed. In his personal diary, found after the war, he wrote what he could not say to anyone during those days. Words that reveal a man broken by the weight of command. A man who kept giving orders knowing that every word he said meant death. Every decision has become a death sentence. There is no longer any tactic, no strategy. I order starving, frozen men without ammunition to hold positions that are nothing but rubble. Every word I say over the phone costs human lives. When I say, hold on, 50 men die. When I say, retreat, 100 die. There is no logic anymore, only the mechanism of destruction that keeps turning. The men eat snow to calm their hunger. They cut pieces of leather from their jackets to make laces. They sleep embracing corpses to avoid freezing to death. And I'm still here, with the phone in my hand, commanding an army that no longer exists. I transmit orders to divisions that on paper have 10,000 men, but in reality have 300. I order counterattacks to regiments that no longer have a single working tank. The temperature has dropped to -30. The wounded die within hours because we have no medicine, no bandages, not even a warm place to put them. We pile them up in basements and wait for them to stop breathing. Some beg to be finished off. We cannot waste bullets. The food ran out weeks ago. The soldiers eat dead horses. Then they eat boiled boot leather. Then they stop eating altogether. They become skeletons moving mechanically, empty eyes in hollow faces. Some no longer have the strength to hold their rifles. They fall into the snow and never get up again. I receive calls from battalion commanders. They tell me, "Sir, my men can no longer fight. They have no ammunition, no strength." And I must answer, "Hold the position." That's an order. I hear the silence on the other end. Then the voice says, "Jawohl, Herr General." And I know I have just killed those men. The soldiers do not hate me. That's the worst part. They look at me like one looks at a father who can no longer help you. They understand I have no choice. They thank me when I send them into one last counterattack. They tell me, "At least we will die fighting, Herr General." And I nod, because I no longer have a voice to answer. I have no more tears, no more God, only frost and death. I look at the map and see red circles tightening. I see the names of units that no longer exist. I see a city that has become a tomb for 100,000 men. And I am one of those who put them in that tomb. Berlin keeps sending messages of encouragement. They tell us we must resist for the honor of Germany, that our sacrifice will not be forgotten. But here, among frozen ruins and piled corpses, honor is just an empty word, a word that doesn't warm, a word that doesn't feed, a word that doesn't bring the dead back to life. A captain asked me, "When will it end, sir?" I looked out the window. Snow was falling on the corpses. Smoke was rising from the ruins. The Russians were tightening the encirclement, and I answered, "Soon." I didn't have the courage to tell him the truth, that it would end when we were all dead or prisoners, that there was no way out, that we were only prolonging the agony. Paulus surrendered on January 31st. Hitler promoted him to field marshal the day before, thinking that no German field marshal would ever surrender. He was wrong. Paulus chose to save what remained of his men. I kept fighting, not for honor, not for Germany. Only because I no longer knew how to do otherwise. I had become a machine that gave orders, a broken mechanism that kept functioning out of inertia. On February 2nd, 1943, Karl Strecker signed the surrender, hours after Paulus. His last radio transmission was, "The 11th Corps has fought to the last bullet," for the honor of the German soldier. Then he destroyed the radio and surrendered to the Soviets. He spent 11 years in prison camps. When he returned to Germany in 1954, he never spoke of Stalingrad again. He wrote no memoirs, gave no interviews. He lived his final years in silence. The weight of those days had completely emptied him. Second testimony, Heinz Guderian, the general who watched his machines devour the world. Heinz Guderian was not just a commander. He was a war engineer, a man who believed in speed, coordination, and the idea that thought could triumph over bullets. During the Second World War, he became the father of the Lightning War, the Blitzkrieg, the strategy that swept across half of Europe in just a few months. But behind the technical coldness, behind the maps and operational plans, there was also a man who began to question where his own genius was leading. In his book, Panzer Leader, Guderian described with surgical precision the early operations in Poland in September 1939. Yet in his personal diaries, discovered after the war, nuances emerge that do not appear in official reports. He wrote, "It was my first major offensive with armored divisions. I watched the columns move like metallic snakes across the Polish plains. The air vibrated with the roar of the Maybach engines. The smell of oil and gunpowder mingled with the smoke of burned villages. We had perfected every detail. Every platoon knew what to do. Every radio transmitted my order, 'Schnell! Forward!' Yet when we passed through the first village after the bombardment, I saw women digging in the earth to find their children. I had never seen a burned child before that day. That night, I could not sleep. It was the first time I understood what it means to win too fast." His obsession with speed made him famous among the Germans and feared by their enemies. But for Guderian, speed was not just a tactic, it was a philosophy. He believed that anyone who paused to reflect on the battlefield was already dead. During the 1940 French campaign, his armored divisions crossed the Ardennes in a maneuver considered impossible. They bypassed the French, circumvented the Maginot Line, and reached the English Channel in just a few days. Yet behind the military precision, Guderian also experienced an inner conflict between obedience and conscience. In one passage of his diary he noted, "The dawn over the Ardennes was one of the most beautiful I have ever seen. The fog slowly lifted, and beneath us moved hundreds of tanks. It was a river of steel flowing into the heart of France. My men laughed, shouted, believed themselves invincible. I, however, felt something I had never felt before. Fear. Not for myself, but for what we were unleashing. Every time a panzer advanced, behind it lay rubble, smoke, fleeing families. And yet I knew that if I hesitated, the whole plan would collapse. So I simply said, "Forward. Always forward." Guderian was not a fanatical Nazi. He was a soldier who believed in discipline and the logic of war, not in Hitler's ideological madness. But he soon realized that his victories were feeding that very madness. During the invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, his armored divisions advanced to Smolensk, opening the way to Moscow. But the Eastern Front was not like Poland or France. There, the land itself seemed to resist. The mud, the cold, the immense distances, and the Soviet resistance wore down his men and his convictions. He wrote, "It was September, and snow was already falling on our tents. Engines froze, soldiers shivered. They asked me to push on to Moscow. I replied that it was madness. We had no fuel, no supplies, no fresh men. But the order came anyway. Advance." When the first dispatches arrived from the infantry units, I read the same words, always the same. "We are freezing to death. The tanks no longer move." I transmitted to headquarters, "A withdrawal is needed." They answered, "The Führer does not approve a retreat." In that moment, I realized that I was no longer commanding an army, but a collective death sentence. The decisions he made during those days haunted him for the rest of his life. Guderian was one of the few officers to openly defy Hitler. In a famous confrontation at Vinitsa in 1941, he raised his voice against the Führer himself, saying, "My men are not cannon fodder." He was temporarily removed from command, but recalled in 1943, when Germany was already on the brink of disaster. In his final wartime diary, before the defeat, he wrote words no military manual would ever dare publish. "I believed war could be a problem to solve, an equation of force, time, and space. I was wrong. War is a fire that consumes even those who ignite it. Every order given, every calculated move, has a cost not shown on maps. When I look at my tanks, I no longer see ingenuity and progress. I see steel graves." After the war, as a prisoner of the Allies, Guderian refused to present himself as a martyr or a hero. He simply said that he had served as a soldier, but also that he had understood too late the line between duty and guilt. In a letter to a friend, dated 1947, he wrote, "I do not fear the judgment of men. I fear only that of my dead soldiers. They had no choice. He died in 1954, quietly, in his home in Bavaria. On his desk, next to photographs of panzer tanks and maps of the front, they found a note with only 3 words: Denken, lernen, erinnern. Think, learn, remember. It was the final testament of a man who had invented a new form of warfare, and who, in doing so, had learned how every human innovation, if stripped of ethics, can become a machine that devours everything, even its own creator. Third testimony, Hitoshi Imamura, the general who watched his men die of hunger. Hitoshi Imamura was 54 years old when he found himself commanding a ghost army. He was a general, commander of the Japanese 8th Army in Rabaul, on the Solomon Islands. In 1943, the Allies completely isolated the base. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers were cut off. No supplies, no way out, only waiting. The war continued elsewhere, but in Rabaul, time had stopped. The soldiers no longer fought. They had no enemies left to face. They had only hunger, a hunger that slowly devoured an entire army. Imamura knew there was no hope. Tokyo could not help them. The ships could not pass. The planes could not land. But he had to keep commanding. He had to pretend there was still a purpose. He had to look at men dying of hunger and tell them to endure. In his personal diary, found after the war, he wrote what he lived through in those months. Words that reveal the horror of commanding when you can no longer do anything for your men. I saw my soldiers die not from bullets, but from hunger, one by one, like trees falling in a silent forest. At first, we tried to ration food. Then the food ran out. We began to eat leaves, then roots, then insects. Then there was nothing left to eat. The soldiers became skeletons. They called us the Ghost Army because we no longer fought. We only waited for death. Some fell as they walked and never got up again. Others fell asleep and never woke up. Death by hunger is slow. It drains your strength little by little. It takes away your clarity. It takes away your will. In the end, it even takes away your fear. They asked me for orders, and I had no orders to give. They asked me for rice, and I had no rice. They asked me for hope, and I no longer had a voice to answer. What do you say to a man who weighs 40 kilos and looks at you with eyes that no longer see? What do you order soldiers who no longer have the strength to hold a rifle? Some began eating snakes. Others ate boiled bark. Still others ate things no one spoke about. I knew. Everyone knew. There were bodies that disappeared in the night, wounds on corpses that were not battle wounds. But I could do nothing. I could not punish men dying of hunger for trying to survive. One night, a captain came into my bunker. He was as thin as a skeleton. He could barely stand. He said in a broken voice, "Sir, my men have fed on the dead sergeant." What should I do? I looked at him. I saw the shame in his eyes. I saw the horror of what they were becoming. I did not answer immediately. Then I told him only to go back to his men. What could I order? There are no orders for something like that. Morale collapsed. Some soldiers committed suicide. They preferred to die with honor rather than starve like animals. Others went insane. They talked to themselves. They laughed for no reason. Some screamed for days until they died of exhaustion. We commanders could only watch. Helpless, useless, Tokyo ordered us to resist, to never surrender, to be ready to repel an attack. But what attack? The Americans didn't even need to attack us. We were dying on our own. Every day we buried dozens of men. Every week an entire company disappeared from the list, not because of combat, only because of hunger and disease. I began writing false reports to Tokyo. I wrote that the situation was under control, that the soldiers were ready, that morale was high. Lies, all lies. But if I had told the truth, what would have changed? Nothing. They would have only ordered us to die with more dignity. When the surrender came, in August 1945, we were no longer soldiers. We were shadows, skeletons in tattered uniforms with empty souls. Of the more than 100,000 men I commanded, only a little over 70,000 survived. The dead did not fall in battle. They fell in their bunks. They died slowly. They died in silence. I served the emperor. I obeyed orders. I did my duty. But I am no longer worthy of looking at the scion. To command without being able to save is the greatest shame of a man. I watched 30,000 soldiers die and could do nothing. Nothing. Hitoshi Imamura was tried as a war criminal, not for what happened in Rabaul, but for other actions during the war. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. In his last words in court before the verdict, he said something that struck even the judges. I do not ask for forgiveness. I only ask that someone remember how heavy an order can be, how much it can cost to obey when you know you're sending men to their deaths. He was released from prison in 1954. He returned to Japan. He spent his last years in a Buddhist monastery, seeking the peace he had not found during the war. He died in 1968. On his bedside table, they found a faded photograph. Hundreds of soldiers lined up in Rabaul. Before the nightmare began, before hunger devoured them, before they became ghosts. 3 men, 3 armies, 3 hells, but the same crushing weight. The weight of command when there is no longer hope, of giving orders knowing they are useless, of watching men die and being powerless to save them. These commanders were not heroes, nor were they monsters. They were men trapped in impossible situations, men who had to choose between obeying absurd orders and abandoning their men. Men who lived carrying the weight of every life lost. War does not only create victims on the battlefield, it creates victims among those who survive. All 3 survived, but survival does not mean living. It only means continuing to breathe while carrying within you the weight of all those who didn't make it. This is the true face of command in war, not glory, not honor. Only a weight you can never let go of, one you carry to the grave. Tell me in the comments which battle you would like us to cover in the next video. See you in the next one.